Today, the Disneyland Monorail is an iconic part of the park. Not only great as just a standalone attraction, but also is a pretty useful mode of transportation in and around it as well. It's really just one of those Disneyland classics that you almost can't even imagine not being there. But the monorail wasn't always there, and prior to its opening back in 1959, there was actually another attraction that could be found in that same area. An attraction that, in retrospect, can almost be thought of as a predecessor for the monorail, showcasing its own idea of futuristic rail travel. That attraction, of course, being the Viewliner train of tomorrow. Quite possibly one of the shortest-lived rides in the park's history, the Viewliner only existed at Disneyland for a little over a year, also making it one of their lesser-known X-attractions. So, with this video, I really want to hone in on that specific ride, mainly to get a better idea of its history, but also to see how it relates back to the original monorail. So, let's go ahead and get into it. The Viewliner as an idea first popped up around 1956. At the time, Disney was just looking for some kind of new attraction to put in the northeast corner of the park, after they had removed the Mickey Mouse Club Circus earlier that year, leaving behind a large chunk of unused space. And seeing as how whatever they were going to put there would very likely be another temporary attraction, Walt opted to go with something cheap and easy to construct, some kind of train. Not only was he personally a big fan of them, but trains were probably one of the cheapest attractions you could get at the time, due to the fact that you only had to lay the tracks for it and build the vehicle itself, completely avoiding any kind of major construction. But Disneyland already had itself a train, in fact a couple of trains at that point, so they opted to do something a little different with this new one, choosing this time to model it after GM's recently unveiled Aero Train.
From LaGrange, Illinois, comes the experimental Aero Train, representing GM's new concept in railroading. Viewers acclaim it as promising a standard gauge revolution comparable to that which attended the adoption by the roads of air brakes. For the Aero Train is the answer to a request by the railroads for new ideas and equipment, things that would cut costs, increase speed, improve riding comfort, and above all, reduce passenger deficit.
The futuristic Aero Train was first introduced back in 1955 and began running from New York to Pittsburgh in early 1956, later expanding with a second new line that same year that went from Los Angeles to Vegas. Designed by General Motors, the Aero Trains were meant to act as the train of the future. By being more closely related to a car, they were trying to introduce a fresh perspective in locomotion, and also bring some more life back into the withering industry, by now creating trains with a sleek, futuristic look, and their own kind of unique air suspension system, which was supposed to allow for a smoother ride. Based on GM's design, Disney began to work on their own version of the Aero Train, which they thought would have been the perfect attraction for the slowly blossoming Tomorrowland. Initially, the project was being led by Imagineer Bob Gurr, who started off by sketching out some basic ideas for the Viewliner, eventually deciding to make the Disneyland version smaller than the original train, at about half scale, just to simplify the whole process. Those concepts were later refined, and they began actually building the train not too long afterwards. Meanwhile, over at the park, tracks were already being put down for the new attraction by a third-party contractor. So, Gurr was only tasked with creating the locomotive itself, which was easier said than done. Not unlike the original Aero Train, which actually repurposed the shell of an old intercity highway bus, the Viewliner would also be made up of various different vehicle parts. Specifically, the two bodies from both a 1954 and a 1956 Oldsmobile, now powered by a V8 gasoline engine, also from an Oldsmobile. And through scavenging some miscellaneous other parts from a couple of old trucks and Jeeps, they also created the Viewliner suspension system as well. Once the two different trains were finally built, both of the over 5,000-pound locomotives were each taken from the Walt Disney Studio in Burbank over to Disneyland and painted there on site. But after that, the Viewliner was ready to make its official debut on June 10th of 1957.
Among the newest attractions in Tomorrowland are the fast, sleek Viewliners, the commuter trains of the future. This is a streamlined way of seeing Tomorrowland. Railroading of tomorrow and yesterday are passing in review. Take your choice.
Back when it first opened, the attraction was originally sponsored by the Santa Fe Railway Company, just like the Disneyland Railroad, in an attempt to represent both the past and apparent future of rail travel. In reality, though, the train actually functioned more like an Oldsmobile fixed to a railroad track, rather than a traditional locomotive. And with its use of a repurposed car engine, the Viewliner's speed ranged from an average of 30 miles per hour all the way up to a top speed of 60, which would be roughly 120 and 240 miles an hour respectively, had the trains been built in full scale. And by still utilizing an automatic transmission, the train's 8-wheel drive could let the Viewliner reach its peak acceleration in about 15 seconds, one of the reasons they dubbed it the fastest miniature train in the world. The attraction ran on a figure-8 track through parts of Tomorrowland and Fantasyland, with a different station at each of them for the two separate trains, including the orange Tomorrowland train that had its cars named after different planets, and the blue Fantasyland one, with its cars named after various Disney characters. But at the same time, outside of the park, the Viewliner's real-life counterpart wasn't doing so well. While they had originally been created to try and introduce some innovation into the locomotive industry, the Aero trains ended up being a noble but ultimately unsuccessful attempt at doing so, as they mainly suffered from a somewhat flimsy build, leading to a general discomfort for their riders, on account of them being made out of the same bodies that buses were, and not the regular steel that other trains used. So, all that coupled with the competition of other emerging travel options, like cars and planes, really put the Aero trains at a disadvantage, eventually leading to them ceasing operations by October of 1957, only 3 months after the Viewliner had opened at Disneyland. Luckily though, the Viewliner was only meant to be a temporary attraction, and plans were already underway for a replacement ride before the Aero trains even stopped running. So, when those plans were eventually completed, the Viewliner permanently closed on September 30th of 1958 to make way for one of the park's biggest updates. Ultimately, the space the old train occupied ended up being home to several new attractions, including the Matterhorn, part of the lagoon for Submarine Voyage, and of course, the Monorail. Similarly designed by Bob Gurr, the first Monorail can really be thought of as a spiritual successor to the Viewliner, another attempt at a new train of the future. Of course, the technology behind both attractions were still wildly different, but the similarities are still noticeable, even down to a similar look and a station in the same place that the old train had one. As for the actual Viewliner itself, both of the trains were removed not too long after its closure, and the tracks were subsequently ripped up as well. Interestingly though, most of the railroad ties from the attraction ended up going to Disney animator Ollie Johnston, who would later use them to make his own backyard railroad at his vacation home. On top of that, Disney actually held on to the Viewliner's locomotive and train cars for quite a while too, initially trying to donate the cars to the newly built Dodger Stadium in hopes that they'd be repurposed as parking trams, but that offer was ultimately rejected, and the trains both remained backstage at Disneyland until the 1970s, when they were eventually scrapped. While it is true that neither the Aero train or its smaller scale Disneyland version fared too well in the end, it's still pretty fascinating to see how Walt tried to incorporate real-life futurism and technology into the park, especially that early in its history. And even though we can probably all agree that the monorail is a more timeless and overall better attraction, I still think it's important to remember the Viewliner too, and its function as a kind of prototype for that ride, in its own sort of way.